In the spring of 1916, inside a stone abbey on the edge of Dartmoor in Devon, England, a 17-year-old monk named Karl Curl walked into the apiary and counted what was left: 16 colonies. A disease that beekeepers called the Isle of Wight Plague had swept across Britain, and almost every native dark bee on the island was dead. At Buckfast Abbey, of around 45 colonies, only 16 still had a living queen, and every one of those survivors was a crossbreed. What nobody understood in that moment was that the monk standing over those 16 hives would spend the next 70 years breeding a single line of bee, and that the genetics he stitched together by hand inside a monastery would outlive him, cross oceans, and end up in hives on every continent except Antarctica. Researchers today call it one of the longest sustained animal breeding programs ever run by a single individual, and almost nobody knows the full story. How does a Benedictine monk, with no formal training in genetics, decide that the only way to save the bees of a continent is to cross them on purpose, and then keep going for 7 decades? To understand why a monastery, you have to go back much further than 1916. For most of European history, the church was the center of beekeeping, not as a hobby, as infrastructure. Catholic liturgy required beeswax candles. The wax of bees was considered the purest substance for the altar, clean burning and sweet smelling, where animal fat tallow was foul. For centuries, church law held that altar candles had to be made largely of beeswax. That single requirement turned wax into one of the most valuable commodities in medieval Europe. By the end of the Middle Ages, a single beeswax candle could cost more than a laborer earned in a day. And the institutions that could keep enough bees to meet that demand were the monasteries. They had the land. They had the literate monks who could read, record, and refine. Abbeys like Cluny in France and the great houses of Germany ran apiaries that supplied honey, mead, medicine, and above all wax. On some estates, peasants paid their rent in beeswax. The Hanseatic League shipped it across the continent. For something close to 1,000 years, the monastery was where the practical knowledge of keeping bees alive through European winters was written down, guarded, and passed on. Buckfast Abbey itself was a beekeeping house in that tradition. Then, in 1913, the parasite arrived. A microscopic mite that lodged in the breathing tubes of adult bees, named for the island where it was first noticed. Whole apiaries collapsed. Across the British Isles, the native dark honeybee, Apis mellifera mellifera, the black bee that had lived in northern Europe for thousands of years, was effectively wiped out. The economics of what to do next were brutal and simple. A beekeeper could buy in foreign queens, Italian bees, gentle and productive, that seemed to shrug off the disease, and replace the dead native stock outright. It was fast, it was cheap, and it worked. And that is exactly what most of Britain did. The native black bee was not so much saved as paved over, replaced colony by colony with imported southern subspecies. Karl Carroll, by now Brother Adam, the name he took as a monk, noticed something the replacement strategy missed. The 16 colonies that survived at Buckfast were not the imported Italians, and they were not the pure natives. They were the crosses. The hybrids between the imported Ligurian Italian bee and the old native British black bee had survived where both parent lines had died. That observation became an obsession that lasted the rest of his life. In 1919, when the Abbey's old beekeeper retired, Brother Adam was put in charge of the apiary. He set himself a goal that sounds almost arrogant for a monk with no laboratory. He would not just rescue a bee, he would build a better one, gentle enough to work without heavy protection, resistant to disease, reluctant to swarm, and productive enough to fill the Abbey's honey supers year after year. To get there, he needed bloodlines from across the bee's entire range. So a Benedictine monk began to travel. Over the following decades, Brother Adam made expeditions across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, hunting for isolated regions where a native strain of bee had stayed genetically pure. Italy for the Ligurian bee, Turkey for the Anatolian, Greece, the Sahara, the mountains, anywhere a distinct race of bee had survived in isolation. He brought queens back to Devon to fold their best traits into his line, but collecting the bees was the easy part. The hard part was control. Here is the engineering problem, and it is the heart of the whole story. A queen bee does not mate once with one partner. On a single flight, she mates in the open air with a dozen or more drones, miles from the hive, from colonies the beekeeper does not own and cannot see. For a breeder trying to keep a pedigree, this is a nightmare. You can choose the mother. You cannot choose the fathers. Every serious attempt to breed bees with precision runs straight into this wall. Brother Adam's solution was geography. A few miles from the abbey sat the high moor of Dartmoor, cold, windy, treeless, empty of wild bees for miles in every direction. In 1925, he established a mating station up on that desolate moor. He carried his virgin queens up there, and he stocked the surrounding area only with drones from his own carefully selected lines. With no other bees for miles, the only males a virgin queen could possibly meet were the ones he had chosen. He went one step further. He inbred his drone-producing colonies and headed them with sister queens, so that the drones they raised were nearly genetically identical to one another. That gave him something almost no beekeeper had ever had: a known father's side. He could now run a true pedigree, recording the ancestry of every queen, worker, and drone, the way a stud farm tracks racehorses. His breeding cycle ran on a 3-year rhythm. Raise a minimum of 30 queens of each new combination. Let the colonies mature and test them in the field for honey, temper, and resistance. Then graft larvae from only the very best to start the next generation. It was slow. He estimated that folding in each new subspecies and stabilizing its traits took roughly a decade of testing, and the records bear out that it worked. By the late 1940s, while the Abbey's 300 colonies averaged around 160 pounds of honey each, the daughters of his single best breeding queen averaged over 200. That number is not a legend. It is in the figures he published himself. If you are watching this and you are not yet subscribed to this channel, this is what we do. We tell stories like this one, sourced to the original research, and we follow them further than anyone else does. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. The bee Brother Adam built has a name now, the Buckfast bee, and it did not stay in Devon. Breeder queens were sent from the abbey to beekeepers in other countries, who raised daughter queens and sent them on again. Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Australia, North America. Beekeepers who tried them found the same combination of gentleness and productivity that Brother Adam had spent his life chasing, and they wanted their own. They began doing exactly what he had done on Dartmoor, setting up isolated mating areas, agreeing among themselves to keep only buckfast drones in the region, protecting the line's genetics by controlling the geography. A federation of European buckfast breeders eventually formed to maintain the pedigree, the unbroken paper trail of ancestry, reaching back to the queens Brother Adam bred by hand. He kept working until 1992, when he finally retired from the Abbey apiary at 93 years old. He died a few years later at 97. And here is the part of this story that turns it from a quaint tale about a monk and his bees into something far larger. While Brother Adam spent the century building a bee, the native bee he started with, the dark European honeybee, Apis mellifera mellifera, was quietly vanishing across its entire range. The same logic that replaced Britain's black bees in 1916 played out across the continent for the next 100 years. Beekeepers imported southern subspecies because they were gentle and productive. Those imports interbred with the natives. The native genetics did not so much die as dissolve, generation by generation, into hybrid swarms. This is what the research now documents in hard terms. A 2020 genomic study in Scientific Reports compared museum honeybees from across Europe against living bees and found a measurable decline in genetic diversity over the 20th century. Conservation papers describe native AM, mellifera populations as extinct or near extinct across much of northern and western Europe, lost to what biologists call introgressive hybridization, the slow swamping of a native gene pool by imported genes. And those native genes are not sentimental baggage. The dark bee carries adaptations to cold, dark northern climates, efficient winter clustering, low food consumption in winter, the ability to fly in cold and wind, traits shaped over thousands of years that the imported southern bees simply do not have. In 1994, an international association was formed for the sole purpose of protecting the European dark bee. Today, the surviving pockets of pure native bees are found in exactly the kind of place you would expect: isolated islands, remote reserves, a population in the Russian Urals that genetic studies trace back to the 12th century, protected in natural tree hollows. The same principle Brother Adam discovered on a windy moor in 1925, that to protect a bee's genetics you must control the geography around it, is now the central strategy of an entire conservation movement. Brother Adam never saw any of that. He died before genomic sequencing could read the diversity loss directly out of museum specimens. He died before the dark bee he started with became a flagship of European conservation. What he knew was narrower, and in its way more human, that the survivors of 1916 were the crosses, that a bee could be built, and that it would take the rest of his life. What he could not have known was that the compound interest of one monk's 70-year obsession would still be paying out a century later, in millions of hives, on a federation's pedigree charts, and in the very logic conservationists now use to save the wild bee he began with. 16 surviving colonies, a windswept moor, a monk who traveled to the Sahara for a queen, and a single line of bee that outlived its maker and crossed the world. The buckfast bee is still being bred, still being sent from breeder to breeder, still gentle on the comb 100 years after the plague that should have ended it all. But Devon is not the only place where a single keeper's obsession quietly rewrote the future of a species. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps us make more videos like these in the future.